SciAnts. We get experimental science. We're curious, non-judgmental.
Y'all remember Dr. Merritt? We had him on. We were doing the live experiment, chatting about the DNA extraction. Today, we're going to have him on for some coffee science. All right, let's add Thomas on. There he is. Hi, Thomas. How's it going? Thank you so much for coming back on with us. Yeah, so folks are excited about to learn about coffee. We chatted a little bit earlier. We maybe just kick off like how you got into coffee science.
Absolutely. So my name's Thomas Merritt. I'm a professor at Laurentian University. I'm a full professor. I've been here since 2006. We work on essentially kind of stress biology. We use fruit flies mostly as a model, but what we mostly study is how individuals vary. So we use stress and we use flies as a tool to ask questions around what makes an individual different from another individual or similar to another individual. And our approach is a little bit different than some labs in that a lot of times labs are looking for like the central story, and what we're looking for is how is the story different in different individuals. We started talking about what got me into science, and I want to talk to people about science. I mean, you and I have very similar goals, and part of that is engaging people. And so if I start to tell you about what we do in the lab, what we do is actually really interesting, but it's not necessarily the easiest way to bring people in. And coffee, in contrast, is something that everybody wants to talk about. Let's think about how we want to structure this. So we should talk about why we drink coffee. Like the central thing is, what gets us drinking coffee, and that's the caffeine. If you think of coffee as a way to talk about science, caffeine is actually a really good way to start. So most of us start with a cup of coffee because we're going to wake up in the morning. Caffeine is a plant toxin. It's a secondary metabolite. It evolved over so many millions of years as part of plant defenses, although we don't exactly know how. There's some really interesting speculation on that. It is a very effective but relatively gentle stimulant. So it's a great way to wake up. We're just lucky it's not killing us because it's a toxin, right? And so this whole idea of like, is it a health food? Is it, we're just lucky it's not killing us. It's a really good to wake up. Way to wake up.
As a toxin, what is the primary thing that it's toxining against, and what is the result of that? Right? Like, what if we were to have the same reaction as whatever insect is feeding on this toxin? What would that look like in us?
Yeah, so that's actually a really great and very unanswered question. So there are a couple of thoughts. So let's see if I can actually stay focused for a second. It's unlikely, but I'll answer two questions. Like, what's caffeine doing to us? And then the other one is, do we have an idea of what caffeine's role is in the ecology of the system? So what it's doing to us is relatively simple. It looks like a neurotransmitter called adenosine, and it looks enough like adenosine that it actually binds to adenosine receptors in the central nervous system. And when it does that, it prevents them from doing their normal role. So it looks enough like adenosine that it binds, but different enough from adenosine that the downstream system is now different. And what it does is it basically breaks a sleep tonic. So adenosine binds to these receptors and is part of keeping you drowsy and sleepy. Caffeine goes in, displaces or prevents adenosine from getting in, and that's what wakes you up. All right? So that's where the stimulant side of this comes from. And then there's a whole other side of it being broken down. But there's genetic variation in those receptors, and so there are people who respond more or less strongly to caffeine. And so we started this on one of my tangents. One of the cool things about caffeine is you can talk about individual variation. So individuals respond differently to adenosine or to caffeine based on their adenosine genotype. But it's not deterministic. I can tell you what your genotype is. I can give you sort of a percentage of how likely you are to be a strong responder or a weak responder, but it's not a yes/no answer. Okay, but that's why we wake up when we drink a cup of coffee. The adenosine or the caffeine displaces adenosine, binds to these. It's an agonist, binds to the adenosine receptors, breaks that normal pathway, leads to activation of another set of pathways, and ultimately releases dopamine. So caffeine wakes you up, but also there's a legitimate euphoria that's associated with that. And if that's ringing bells, dopamine is also involved with sex. So basically, coffee is almost as good as sex in that it's triggering that same molecular pathway. It's not exactly true, but it's close enough. So that's sort of some of the human biology around that. The ecological role of caffeine is a bit up in the air. And there are a couple of sort of predominant theories as to what it does. A lot of them make sense. One of them is particularly fun. It's unlikely to be true, but it is so cool that we just have to run with it. So it has been demonstrated that caffeine has a certain amount of herbicide properties. And so in coffee, so there are about 5 different groups of plants that produce caffeine. Really interestingly, they do it in different ways. So the biochemistry of creating caffeine in tea is a separate set of genes than the biochemistry in coffee, and that's not something that's immediately obvious, intuitive. It is actually obvious when you look at the biochemistry, but it's not necessarily something we would guess. So caffeine has been independently evolved in at least 5 different plant lineages. So in tea, we drink the leaves. In coffee, we're drinking the seeds that are within the cherry. But caffeine is throughout the plant. And so one of the theories is that the caffeine that's in the coffee plants is in the leaves fall down, and they create this area around the coffee plant where other plants don't grow.
Oh, that's really cool.
It's super cool, but it's probably not real. So the other one is it has a certain antibacterial property, and so maybe it's clearing other things out as well. So there are a couple of theories that it's either an herbicide, and I said bacteria, and I'm in my head, I'm like, that doesn't sound right. It's pesticide.
Is that similar to nicotine? Like we think how that evolved, or caspasins?
Yeah, and with equal amount of experimental evidence to support all of those. Right?
So we're just kind of shooting from the hip on part of these.
Oh, it's a just so story. It's totally the elephant's nose has been stretched out.
Out of curiosity for the chat, when you're saying like it's that elephant nose and that stretch, how do you determine as a scientist where it's that kind of stretch? Like from your perspective, when you're reading something, what is the threshold for convincing versus what is the threshold, like you're saying, of like, it's cool, but it probably, we don't have enough data for it.
Yeah, so I mean, you and I both have an evolutionary bent in what we do. The issue with evolutionary biology, and the reason that my lab is primarily focused on biochemistry and not evolution, is we can't answer questions about something that happened 5 million years ago. We can make inferences and we can put together stories that make sense, but you can't re-evolve the system. So it's really hard to experimentally test these. Is caffeine an herbicide? Yeah. Is it an insecticide? 100%. Is that how the system evolved through time? I can't tell you that. Can I make a story that makes sense? Absolutely. Can I experimentally test it? That's a harder thing to do. But let me tell you the last one that's actually just super, super cool. It ends up that caffeinated bees seem to have an easier time of returning to caffeinated flowers than non-caffeinated flowers. And so there is this theory that caffeine may have evolved as a memory stimulant in insects. And so the insects that go to these caffeinated flowers better remember the location of caffeinated flowers than non-caffeinated flowers. And so the fact that caffeine wakes us up, caffeine also has impact on memory and performance, which is something we can talk about. And it may be that caffeine is essentially a performance-enhancing drug for winged pollinators.
Which is...
I would be super surprised, but it is such a cool story. And I will tell you that you can experimentally test it. Like this one they've tested. Do bees remember caffeinated flowers better than uncaffeinated flowers? They do. Is that how it evolved? I don't know.
It would be cool if it co-evolved with the rise of pollinators, right? If there was like a little bit of a step behind that.
So, okay, but it's super cool. And the issue is that it's evolved independently 5 times. Mm-hmm. And if it was that simple, why isn't caffeine ubiquitous in flowers, right? So there's not a simple answer there, given these different pathways. And even within coffee, there are non-caffeinated species of coffee.
It's also interesting then, if it's an insecticide, why are pollinators coming to it, right? So it must be a dosage question as well on top of everything else. And then
and that's
from the chat too, is there then an addiction? Are insects in some way then addicted to the flowers in a way too, of like a taste preference, because this stimulant is like going back to it?
So that's actually the argument that's being made. Now, again, addiction is a tough word, but the argument that's being made in some of these evolutionary studies is that the caffeine has evolved in plants as part of a pollination system because caffeinated flowers were more successfully pollinated than non-caffeinated flowers. That's a tough argument in that caffeine is so limited. Part of that game would be, okay, so what are the pros and cons? If you're investing in caffeine production, does that mean that there's less energy being invested elsewhere? And potentially that's why you have some species that are caffeinated and some that are not. I don't have an answer to that.
But a really cool thought experiment nonetheless.
It's a really cool, and the fact that you could actually demonstrate a difference in behavior between caffeinated and non-caffeinated pollinators is just super cool.
And it would be interesting, there has been work, as you know, in flies that have looked at neuropeptide F as an addiction molecule, quote unquote, right, for alcohol addiction in fruit flies. And it would be interesting to see if that molecule is changing as a result of these insects having caffeine. If it is, maybe that they are getting in some kind of like a positive reward feedback system, as we've classically defined addiction in insects. But it could be something different.
So, as a fly researcher who spends a lot of time talking about caffeine, I have been asked why we don't do more caffeine work with flies. So caffeine in humans is a stimulant that we consume to wake us up, and we're just lucky it's not killing us. Caffeine in insects may be an insecticide, it may be a memory stimulant. It's only biologically relevant in a really small fraction of the insect and plant population, right? So just because caffeine has a particular role in coffee plants and coffee pollinators doesn't mean it'll have the same role in flies.
So if you were, it's like thinking of the ecology of the animal, right, and designing your experiment. If you're giving an animal caffeine that is never going to be experiencing that in the wild, is the response that it's getting physiologically relevant, or is it just this weird contrived byproduct that you're having?
And my argument is it's the second. Okay. And so if we go in and we test it, like, okay, flies don't poop more when you give them caffeine. Okay.
So it doesn't mean, it wouldn't, if they did, you can be like, oh, that might be informative, but if they don't, you can be like, well, they're not evolved to be on it, so.
It's completely foreign to their biology, so why would we expect it to be the same?
You said not a fruit fly to be testing because it probably didn't evolve on, pollinating these caffeine-based flowers.
Right.
If you had an ideal organism to test some of these questions on and money was not an issue.
This is like in my ideal world, what I would love to do is, okay, that's a really cool question. Coffee is grown globally. Like, I've got coffee plants in my window. They're not doing really well. But essentially, you need a tropical and ideally high-altitude environment. There's a lot of coffee production in Central America, South America. I would love to spend some time at a coffee plantation looking at the insects that are actually pollinating those flowers. Our best guess is that, Arabica is actually a really messed up, genetically unusual species. So it is an allotriploid. It's got two copies of two different species. So instead of having two copies of the genome, it's got three copies of the genome, two from one species, one from another species.
Is it a human-made hybrid, or is it naturally occurring some kind of weird genetic things?
Yeah, it's a naturally occurring weird genetic thing.
Cool.
And that's actually a really super cool. There was a paper that just came out this year where they've sequenced more of the coffee genome, and it looks like. So one of the things that's really pretty cool is that wild coffee. So the answer to that question is, what I really want to do is sit down in Ethiopia and watch to see what is pollinating the wild coffee of Ethiopia, because that's our best guess where this allotriploid evolved. And I'd really like to know what the insect species that are involved there. And I think we really could start to tease apart what's the role of caffeine in that plant, especially if you could contrast it with something like tea, which we know is independently evolved. So what are the insects that are involved in tea? What are the insects that are involved in coffee? There are wild Arabica plants. They look like domestic, or the better way to say it is domestic Arabica looks exactly like wild Arabica. It looks like you just planted the tree in your yard instead of the tree growing wild. But the paper that literally just came out this year says that there's something like a 30,000 year separation in these lineages, while we know that coffee domestication has been something like 1,000 years. So there is a serious disconnect between, we have reasonable documentation that we have been domesticating coffee for maybe 1,000, let's say we're 3 times wrong, 3,000, 5,000 years. I mean, the best guess is still 1,000 years. Genetically, although the plants look identical, the lineage that is domestic coffee seems to be something like 30,000 years old. Like, okay, well, where's that separation? I don't know. That's a super cool question.
And
there's a lot of really neat stuff going on there.
And we harvest from the domesticated.
That's right. But you could go into the wild and pick cherries off a wild Arabica and make a cup of coffee. Different varieties of Arabica. So, okay, between you and me, species don't exist. Species are an artifact. They're not a real thing. Like, species is not a mitochondria. Species is a way that we pretend the world works. But whatever a species is, Arabica has within that species many different varieties. Only some of those varieties are really good. So there are varieties of Arabica that don't make a good cup of coffee. So you'd have to find a decent wild variety of Arabica to make a decent cup of coffee.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you again for your time, by the way. If you're up for coming back, I think the chat would love to have you back. I know people have been talking about the experiment of the extraction ever since you were on. And still, like, harkening back to how cool it was chatting with you and doing the experiment. So we definitely want you back if you're up for it.
No, so, I'll plant some seeds. See what I did? There's some other topics that we can talk about. So there's some really cool stuff that's being done with genetic editing in plants. There's a lot of resistance to the idea of frankenfoods and genetically modified plants. Coffee may be the way to start to sell people on why we need to be doing genetic editing as an extension of the kind of domestication that we've been doing for thousands of years. And so that may be something we can talk about in the next conversation. Thank you so much for having me on. Let's do this again. We'll come up with something and we'll chat again in a month or so.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, and with that in mind, if people have questions that didn't get answered today, absolutely shoot me a message through Instagram and I'll try to get back to you. All right, this was lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Thomas. Have a great night.